Her life sold for a Winchester rifle and 2 blankets. A Lakota chief returned all 3 and kept her. The rifle was still warm when I got there. Not from being fired, from being held. A man grips a thing hard enough, long enough, the metal takes on his heat, and Orville Pratt had been gripping that Winchester since sunup, carrying it around the wagon camp like a new bride. Which was wrong in about 6 different ways, but the one that put me on my horse was this. He hadn't owned a Winchester that morning. I had been scouting 3 miles east, following a creek line that the map called reliable and the land called a liar. Came back into camp around midday to find the cook fire low, half the men standing around looking at their boots, and Pratt walking that rifle barrel up over his shoulder like he was already halfway to Oregon in his head. I asked Hector Wines what happened. Hector was a decent man from Illinois, built like a nail keg, not given to drama. He told me flat, Pratt had traded the woman. I said, which woman? He said the one that came with Pratt's outfit, the one his wife's brother brought along from the Platte Crossing, the Lakota woman. I had noticed her, hard not to. She'd been quiet around the camp for 2 weeks, not shy, not afraid, just economical with herself, the way people get when they're surrounded by strangers they don't fully trust. She did work. Gathered wood, kept the Pratt wagon in order. Never complained. She had a daughter, maybe 4 years old, round-faced and curious, who had taken to following me at a safe distance, and then pretending she hadn't when I looked back. I asked who he traded her to. Hector said a man named Caswell had come through camp that morning, going east, with 2 Arapaho and a pack string loaded with trade goods. Pratt had been short on powder and out of luck, and a deal got made. The Winchester and 2 wool blankets, and Caswell took the woman and her daughter east. I sat on my horse for a moment. Hector said he'd tried to say something. A couple of the other men had too. Pratt told them it wasn't their concern. I looked at Pratt from across the camp. He was checking the action on that rifle, tilting it to catch the light. I turned my horse east. I want to be honest about what I was thinking, because men my age tend to pretty up their motives when they tell a story, and I've told this one enough times that the prettied up version has worn a groove. The truth is I wasn't thinking about the woman exactly. Not yet. I was thinking about Caswell. I knew Caswell by reputation, and by one prior meeting at a Laramie trading post 3 years back. He was the kind of man the frontier makes too many of, not violent by preference, just utterly without anchor. He'd buy and sell anything that would stand still long enough. He'd been run out of 2 territories for practices that even the loose standards of 1866 found objectionable, and he had that particular quality of looking you directly in the eye while meaning you every harm. I knew what he'd do with her. Not immediately, maybe. He'd make a calculation first, but I knew. So that was part of it. The other part, and I'll get to this honestly too, was that I'd watched Pratt for 2 weeks and I hadn't liked what I'd seen. He was the kind of man who measured everything against his own comfort and called it principle. The woman had done good work for his outfit and he'd traded her like a used axle. That offended something in me that I don't have a clean word for. Not chivalry, that's a word for novels. Something harder than that. Something to do with accounts being kept straight. I've spent my life keeping accounts straight. I caught them in 4 miles. Caswell was moving slow on account of his pack string and the woman was walking. She had her daughter on her back, tied there with a piece of cloth, the way some of the plains women carried small ones. She was walking, not being led, and she had her chin level. That's a thing I noticed. Level chin. Eyes forward. I came up alongside Caswell and told him I needed to speak with him. He looked me over. He knew me or knew of me well enough. My name was Caleb Greer, and I'd been scouting the overland route for 6 years. I was not a man who made problems for wagon trains, and I was not a man who created legal complications or went to Fort Commanders with complaints. Caswell knew this. He also knew I was not a man to be pushed. He said, "What did I want?" I told him I was buying the woman and the child back. He smiled. He had bad teeth. He said she wasn't for sale. I said everything was for sale to the right number. He thought about it. He was calculating. I could see it happening behind his eyes. He'd paid a Winchester and 2 blankets. He had uses for the woman, but those uses were speculative. I was here now in front of him with money in my hand. He named a price. It was high. It was meant to be insulting and also meant to be accepted, because he saw I was going to accept it. I paid it. I had the cash money in my kit. I'd been paid for a full season scouting and hadn't spent much of it on anything. I counted it out into his palm and he pocketed it and told his men to leave off with the woman. She had not moved during any of this, stood 3 yards away with the child on her back watching, not the transaction, me. Caswell pulled his string east and didn't look back. I got down off my horse. She spoke before I did. She said something in Lakota. I knew maybe 40 words of that language, and none of them were in what she said. I told her I didn't speak her language well. I said it in the little Lakota I had badly, probably, and then said it in English too. She switched to English. Not fluent but workable. She said, "Are you taking me back to that camp?" I said I was. She said, "To that man." I said, "No, not to him." I said she didn't belong to Pratt or anyone else in that camp, and I'd make that plain. She looked at me for a moment. That look, I've turned it over in my mind 1,000 times since. It wasn't gratitude. It wasn't relief. It was something more like assessment, like she was deciding whether I was telling the truth. She said, "Your name." I told her. She said her name was Wickoppy. It meant star, she told me, though I didn't ask. She said it like she wanted me to know it. Not because she was warming to me, but because she was a person and persons have names, and she was making sure I understood the distinction. Her daughter's name was Sikala, little one. I said those were good names. She said nothing to that. She started walking back toward the wagon camp, west. I walked my horse alongside her at a distance that didn't crowd her, and neither of us said anything more for the next 4 miles. When we got back to camp, Pratt saw us coming and his face went through 4 expressions in about 2 seconds. He settled on indignation, which was the one I'd expected. He said I had no right. I said he'd traded something he had no right to trade. He said she'd been his wife's brother's responsibility, and she was eating his food, and she was. I told him to stop, not loud, I just told him to stop. There's something about a man who has spent years out here, years reading weather and terrain and the temperament of animals and men. You develop a particular quality of stillness when you mean something. Pratt had been a dry goods merchant in Ohio. He read it. He stopped. I told him what was going to happen. The woman and her daughter would travel with the train, but not as property of his outfit. They would be under my protection. Any man in camp who thought otherwise could settle that with me. I said it to Pratt, and then I turned and said it to the camp at large, because I knew Pratt wasn't the only one who'd need to hear it. A few men looked away. Hector Wines nodded once. I told Wickoppy she could use my second tent. I didn't have a wagon. I traveled light and moved between trains, but I had a camp setup that was adequate. She took it without comment. That night I lay in my own tent and listened to the prairie. Wind from the northwest, smell of coming rain, the sound of Sikala murmuring something in her sleep in the tent 10 feet away. I didn't sleep much. The thing about the Overland Trail in the summer of 1866 was that it had been running for 25 years by then, and it had developed a kind of gravity. People got pulled into it. Families who had no real business being there got pulled in by the stories, land in Oregon, a new life, gold in Montana if you were young enough to still believe in gold. They sold everything and joined a train, and 2 months later they were staring at the Medicine Bow Range trying to remember why Ohio had seemed so bad. I had been part of that gravity for 6 years. Scout for hire, which meant I rode out ahead and found the water and the passes and the bad ground and came back and told the wagon master what I'd found, and then he made the decisions and I went out again. Good work. Solitary. I was 47 years old that summer and I had not had a permanent address in a decade. What I had was a reputation. Greer finds the way. Greer keeps his word. Greer doesn't panic and he doesn't quit. I had not had a woman's company in 2 years. That's not the reason I went after Wickoppy. I want to be clear on that because it would be easy and wrong to read it that way. I went after her because it was the right thing and because I could not stand the specific wrong of it. But I am also being honest. I was a lonely man, and I had been a lonely man for longer than I'd admitted to myself. She didn't care about my loneliness. She had her own accounting to do. The second night, she came to where I was checking my saddle at the edge of camp, and she stood there until I acknowledged her, which took me a moment because I was working the cinch ring on a buckle that had been giving me trouble. She said, "How much did you pay?" I told her it was nothing to worry about. She said that was not an answer. I told her the amount. She was quiet, then she said, "I will work it back." I said she didn't owe me anything. She said, "I owe you what it cost. I do not owe you anything else." That was said clearly and without heat, like she was establishing a boundary she expected me to respect. I told her I understood, and that was the exact sum of my expectation. She studied me again with that assessment look. Then she went back to her tent. The next morning she was up before me, which is not easy to do. I rise at first gray, and she had a fire going and water on for coffee. She did not speak to me. She did not need to. I need to tell you about Sakala, because she is part of this. 4 years old, as I said. Round face, 2 braids, a gap between her front teeth where one had come out recently. She had the habit of appearing somewhere near me, and then acting entirely disinterested. And I had learned to play along with this by also acting disinterested. And so for the first week, we developed a kind of mutual studied indifference that fooled nobody. On the 4th day she appeared near me while I was mending a broken bridle, and she watched for a while, and then sat down next to me on the ground and picked up a scrap of leather, and started doing nothing particular with it in imitation of what I was doing. I let that go on for a while without commenting. Then I handed her a piece of cord and showed her a simple knot, and she learned it in about 4 tries, and that was that. After that, she talked to me freely. Most of what she said was in Lakota, which I didn't follow well. But she'd look at me after saying something, and I'd nod and she'd seem satisfied. Occasionally she threw in an English word she'd picked up from the camp: bread, horse, cold, and then a whole string of Lakota, and I'd nod again. Wickoppy watched this from whatever she was doing. She didn't comment. On the 6th day she translated something Sakala had said to me. She said Sakala wanted to know if I was afraid of bears. I said no, not in general, only of specific bears that I had reason to be afraid of. Wickoppy translated this back. Sakala seemed to accept it and moved on to something else. After that, Wickoppy began translating more often. Not constantly, not like a service, more like she was bridging a gap that she had decided was worth bridging. 2 weeks into the resumed journey, we crossed the North Platte at a ford I knew was reliable except in June runoff, and it was now July, so we were fine. But 3 wagons back in the train, there was a family named Duggan, father, mother, 5 children, the oldest maybe 12, who had a wheel that had been giving trouble since Fort Kearny. I had flagged it twice to the wagon master, a decent enough man named Pollock. Both times he'd told Duggan to have it looked at. Both times Duggan had looked at it himself and declared it fine, because Duggan had done a lot of declaring things fine on this trip. The wheel came apart in the ford. Not catastrophically. It didn't collapse. It shattered at the rim, and the wagon canted hard to the right and the current caught the back end. The water wasn't deep, but it was fast and cold, and Mrs. Duggan screamed, and the children scrambled, and Duggan himself stood frozen on the seat doing nothing useful. I was across and turned before the wheel went. I put my horse back into the water. I won't make this more dramatic than it was. The wagon wasn't going anywhere that the axle stuck in the river bottom couldn't hold it. What needed doing was get the children out and then get lines on the wagon and drag it clear. I got 3 of the children off the downstream side before the current could build on them, handed them to men on the bank, went back for the other 2. The youngest was a girl, maybe 2. She was in the water up to her chest, hanging onto the wagon side, not crying, just white-faced and very still. I took her out of the water and put her on the bank, and she sat there for a moment and then started crying, which meant she was fine. I got lines on the wagon with 2 other men and we dragged it out. Took 40 minutes. Cold work. By the time we were done, I was soaked to the waist and the sun was not warm. Wickuppy was at my camp when I got back. She had a fire going, a real one, not the cook fire kind, a warming fire, and she had my dry clothes laid near it. She did not say anything. She handed me a piece of canvas and turned away, and I changed behind it and sat by the fire, and she brought me coffee and sat across from me. After a while she said, "You do that often." I said, "Do what?" She said, "Go back in." I thought about it. I said it wasn't any particular bravery. Someone had to. She looked at me across the fire. She said, "Most men wait to see if someone else will." I didn't have a good answer for that, so I drank my coffee. She said, "I see what you are." She said it plain, no performance in it, just a fact being named. Like she was telling me what the weather was. Something shifted in me when she said that. Something I hadn't expected to shift because I hadn't known it was loose. Now here is a thing I want to tell you about what it means to be a man out on the frontier at my age, in that era. Because people think about it wrong. They think the solitude is the hard part. It isn't. You get used to solitude. You make arrangements with it. The hard part is being known. Going years without anyone who actually knows you. Not knows your name, not knows your reputation, knows you. The specific weight of you, the particular shape of your character, your humor, your stubbornness, the things you've gotten wrong. I had a wife once, Ellen. She died of fever in '61, a year into the war, out in Kansas while I was somewhere in Tennessee. I got the letter 4 months after the fact. That's the kind of thing that does something to a man's sense of the world, not just grief, though there was plenty of that, but the specific wrench of not being present, of the most important thing happening without you. After Ellen, I had 2 years of being in the war, which did its own damage in its own ways. And then 4 years of scouting, and by the summer of '66, I had been a long time without anyone who knew me. I'm telling you this because Wickoppy said, "I see what you are," and the reason it moved me was not that it was romantic. She didn't mean it that way, and I didn't take it that way, but because it was simply true, and she said it like it was a reasonable thing to know about a person. Like she had been paying attention, not because she had to, but because that was how she moved through the world. Watching, reading, deciding what was real. I respected that. I respected it the way you respect something that costs effort and has value, and I had not respected someone that way in a long time. We were 6 weeks out from independence, and still 3 weeks from Fort Bridger when the trouble with Pratt came to a head. He had been building towards something since the Ford crossing. I don't know exactly what had shifted in him. Maybe he thought I'd shown myself useful enough that the camp needed me, and he could therefore push back without consequence. Maybe he was just the kind of man who reestablishes what he thinks his territory is whenever he feels it's slipped. He came to me 2 days after the Ford in the morning, when the camp was busy hitching teams, and I was eating breakfast. He said he wanted the woman and the girl to travel with his outfit again. He said it matter-of-factly, like it was a reasonable request. I looked at him. He said he'd given it thought, and he believed he'd acted hastily before, and he meant to correct it. She could work for her keep, and there'd be no more nonsense with Caswell. I said, "She doesn't travel with your outfit." He said, "I have a claim." I said, "You don't. You sold whatever claim you thought you had. He said he'd been pressured into that. I said, by who? He opened his mouth and then closed it. I said, you made that trade of your own free choice at 6 in the morning when no one was watching. There was no pressure. Now you're looking at a man who has set up a better camp than yours, who just pulled your neighbor's children out of a river, who has found every ford and pass and watering hole that's kept this train alive for 6 weeks, and you've decided this is the moment to press a claim on a woman who is not your property and has no wish to be. He looked at me for a long time. The camp had gone a little quiet. I said, don't do this. He looked around, saw the faces. He walked away. I ate the rest of my breakfast. Wickuppy had heard some of it. Not all, I think. That evening she sat near the fire, and after a while she said, you didn't tell him I was your woman. I said I hadn't told him that because it wasn't true. She said most men would have. It would have been easier. I said easier wasn't the point. I said she wasn't a piece of paper you stamped a name on to settle a dispute. She was a person with her own account. She was quiet for a while. The fire was low and the sky was full of stars, and Sakala was asleep in the tent behind us. She said, my husband died 3 winters ago. I said I was sorry. She said he was a good man. She said her people's band had been pushed south from their winter grounds, and her husband had died of the sickness that followed a bad winter, and she had been living with her mother's sister's family when her mother's sister's husband, the man she called Pratt's wife's brother, the one who'd brought her west, had decided she was a burden and made arrangements to attach her to Pratt's party in exchange for a debt cancellation. She said it without self-pity, just the account. I said, that's a bad run of things. She said, yes. I said, what do you want to do? When we reach a settlement, a fort, wherever you want, what do you want to do? She looked at me. I don't think anyone had asked her that in a long time, maybe ever. She said she wanted to go back to her people if there was a way. She said she didn't know where they were now. That was the honest answer. She didn't know. I said I'd ask around at Bridger. There were men at every fort who knew the movements of the bands. Someone would know something. She said, why? I said, because it's what you want. She looked at me in the firelight, and I looked back, and neither of us said anything more, and the wind came up from the southwest, and the fire flattened and caught again. The last third of the trail is always the hardest. People know that. The excitement of departure is 6 weeks gone, and the arrival is still 6 weeks away, and everything in between is just endurance. The wheels grinding, the oxen suffering, the dust that gets into everything including your lungs, the feet of children who have worn through their boots and are walking on raw heels. I had done this stretch enough times that I didn't feel it much, but I watched it in the camp, the way the optimism curdled into grievance and the grievances found targets. Wickoppy was a target that some people in camp had never quite left alone. Not Pratt, he had the sense to stay quiet after our exchange, but there were others. Women mostly, which surprises people when I say it, but it shouldn't. Some of the women in that train had sold everything they owned for a chance at Oregon, and their hands were chapped, and their children were sick, and their husbands were failing them in various ways. And having a Lakota woman in camp who moved with a self-possession they'd been trained out of was not a comfort to them. There was a woman named Hetty Carver who made a point of referring to Wickoppy in terms I won't repeat, whenever she thought I was in earshot. Maybe she thought I'd tolerate it because the women's business wasn't mine to involve myself in, or maybe she just needed something to push on. One afternoon Hetty said something to Wickoppy directly, at the water barrel, something ugly, and I wasn't nearby. Hector Wines told me about it later. He said Wickoppy had looked at Hetty Carver for a long moment without saying anything, and then said 3 words in Lakota, quiet and unhurried, and turned and walked away. Hector said he didn't know what the 3 words meant, but Hetty Carver had gone white as a sheet. When I asked Wickoppy about it that evening, she said she'd told the woman something her grandmother used to say about people who stab with their mouths, because their hands are too weak for honest fighting. I laughed. I hadn't laughed in a while. It surprised me. Wickoppy looked at me laughing, and there was something in her face, not a full smile, not yet, but the edge of one, something coming forward that she'd been keeping back. She said, "You have a good laugh." I said it came out when it felt like it. She said, "I know, that's why I said it." 3 days before Fort Bridger, Sakala got sick. Fever came on fast, the way a child's fever does, 1 hour fine and the next hour burning. I had a limited kit for sickness, some quinine, some basic wound supplies, but a child's fever was beyond my direct competence. There was a woman in camp, a Mrs. Holt, who had done some nursing in Indiana, and she came and looked at Sakala and said it was likely just the trail sickness, the kind of infection small children picked up from bad water and dust and cold nights, and what was needed was rest and liquids and the fever to break on its own. Wickoppy sat with Sakala all that night. I sat nearby, outside the tent, close enough to hear, not because I was needed, I just couldn't be somewhere else. Around 2 in the morning, Wickoppy came out of the tent. She sat down across from me. Her face was tight, controlled. She was afraid, and she was not going to perform the fear, but she was also not going to pretend it wasn't there. She said, "She is sleeping. The fever is the same." I said, "Mrs. Holt knows what she's talking about. Children run fevers on this trail. They come through them." She said, "I know." Then she said, "I have been alone with it for a long time. The fear. I am used to being alone with it." I said, "You're not alone with it now." She looked at me. I said it again, quieter, "You're not alone with it now." She looked at me for a long time. The night was cold and clear, and the stars were what they always are out here, staggering, indifferent, very large. And she did something I had not expected. She reached across the space between us and put her hand over my hand, not grasping, just laying it there, the weight of it. She said, "I know that." We sat like that for a long time. Around dawn the fever broke. Sakala woke up hungry and annoyed at being in the tent, and we could hear her complaining about it from outside. And Wickoppy made a sound that wasn't a laugh exactly, but was the thing that comes when the worst doesn't happen, and she took her hand back and went in to her daughter. I sat by the cold fire for a while with the sky going pink in the east. I had not felt anything so clearly in years, as I had felt the weight of that hand. Fort Bridger was busy the way frontier forts always are in summer, crowded, noisy, smelling of animals and smoke, and the particular desperation of people who have been traveling too long. We pulled in on a Tuesday, and I had the train squared away by early afternoon, and then I went and found the men who would know what I needed to know. There was a trader at Bridger named Garvey who had been working the Wyoming Territory for 15 years, and who knew the movement of every band within 200 miles about as well as anyone alive. He was a rough-looking man who ate jerked meat constantly and talked with his mouth full, but his information was reliable. I asked him about Wickoppy's people, the band she'd named, the general region. He chewed for a moment, and then told me that band had moved north in the spring, up toward the Black Hills. He said there'd been a gathering of several bands in late July up toward the Bell Forch drainage. I said, "How would a woman get there from here, with a child?" He looked at me. He knew something about my business without me telling him. Men like Garvey always do. He said she'd need a guide or a party heading north. There's a man named Crow Feather, mixed blood, who moves between here and the Black Hills 3 times a year. Next trip north is in 3 weeks. He takes passengers if they're square. I said I'd pay for passage. Garvey said, "Your woman wants to go home." I said, "She's not my woman. She wants to go home," and I said I'd help her do it. Garvey chewed his jerky and looked at me. I asked him what. He said, "Nothing. Just you're either the straightest man I've met in 20 years or you're a fool." I told him I might be both. That evening I told Wickopi what I'd found. I told her about Crow Feather, the 3-week wait, the route north. I told her I'd pay for the passage. She listened to all of it. When I finished, she sat for a long time without speaking. I said, "Is that what you want?" She said, "It is what I said I wanted." I said, "That's not the same thing as what you want now." She looked at me sharply, not angry, more like I'd said something that landed somewhere unexpected. She said 3 weeks. I said, "Crow Feather leaves in 3 weeks." She said, "You will stay at the fort 3 weeks." I said my contract with Pollock's train ended here. I had a week before my next engagement. After that, I could find work at the fort until Crow Feather left. It wasn't a hardship. She said, "You would do this." I said I'd help you get where you wanted to go. That's what I said. She was quiet, then she said, "You keep your word." I said, "I try." She said, "Most men I have known keep their word until it becomes inconvenient." I said, "I know the type." She said, quieter, "I know you're not that type." We were sitting in the fort's yard, the noise of it all around us, and she was looking at me the way she'd been looking at me since that night at the ford, that assessment that had gradually become something else, something I didn't want to put a word to because putting a word to it seemed like a way of being wrong about it. She said, "What is your next engagement?" I said, "A train going to California, leaves from here in 6 weeks." She said, "California." I said, "It's work." She said, "After that?" I said I didn't know. There was always more work. The country was endless. She said, "Is that what you want?" I had said exactly the same thing to her not 5 minutes ago, and she was saying it back to me, and she knew what she was doing. I could tell by the set of her mouth. I said, "I want a lot of things I've stopped thinking about." She said, "Why?" I said, "Because wanting things you can't have is a way of making yourself miserable." She said, "And if you could have them?" I said, "Nothing." She said, "I am asking you honestly what you would want if it were possible." I looked at the fort wall, the flag up top, a mule tied to a post nearby switching flies with its tail. I said, "I'd want to stop moving long enough to know a place, and a person. I'd want to know what a good morning feels like when you're not getting ready to ride out. I'd want." I stopped. She waited. I said, "I'd want to feel like I was known to someone, not my reputation, me." She said, "I know you." She said it the same way she'd said, "I see what you are, at the river. Plain, no decorating it, a fact." I looked at her. She said, "I have watched you for 8 weeks. I know how you think. I know what you do when you are uncertain. You go very still, and your hands get quiet. I know you gave my daughter your best piece of cord for a knot she wanted to learn, and then you told her it was just spare. I know you checked the cinch on your horse twice this morning because you were distracted, and you never ride distracted." She said, "I know you are careful with people's dignity in ways you think no one notices." I didn't say anything. She said, "You have been kind to me and to my daughter not because you want something and not because you pity us. I have had enough of men who do things because they want something, and I have had enough of men who pity me. You are not that." She said, "I am telling you that I see you. I am telling you that I am choosing to tell you this. I am not lost. I am not grateful to the point of stupidity. I am a woman who knows her own mind, and I am telling you that I know you and I am not afraid of that." The yard was loud. Somebody's horses got into a dispute over water rights, and a man was shouting and a dog was barking, and the world was going about its business. I said, "What are you saying?" She said, "I am saying that I may not want to go to the Black Hills." I said, "What do you want?" She said, "I want to know what you want first." I said, "I want to find a place in this territory, and I want to build something in it, and I want to do that with you and Sakala if you'd have me." She looked at me for a long time. Long enough that I became aware of my heartbeat, which I generally don't need to be aware of. She said yes. One word. She said it like it cost her nothing, which meant it cost her everything, which is how the important ones go. I need to tell you about the 3 weeks at Fort Bridger before we get to the end of this. Because the 3 weeks matter, and because memory isn't always linear and I've been going mostly forward, but there are pieces I circled back to catch. Crow Feather did leave for the Black Hills on schedule. Wickapi spoke to him and told him she wasn't going. He understood. He was a man who had moved between worlds his whole life, and he did not need things explained to him that were self-evident. I found work at the fort doing what I was good at, scouting short routes, running information between the fort and 2 army patrols to the north, working one leg of a survey party. Good work, steady, and it let me stay. Garvey looked at me one morning over his jerky and said, "Still here?" I said, "Still here." He said, "Huh," then went back to his business. Wickapi and Sakala were settled in a room at the fort, nothing grand, just a room but dry and warm and private. I was in the men's quarters. In the evenings we ate together and talked. She was teaching me Lakota, not systematically, just as things came up, so that by the 3rd week I had 3 times as many words as I'd had, and Sakala had stopped pretending to be indifferent because apparently once your mother is teaching a man your language, the pretense becomes too much work. The California train came, and I found another man to take the scout job on it. He was younger than me and knew the route. I wrote the wagon master a letter of explanation and apology and paid back a portion of the advance. It was the first time in my professional life I'd broken a contract, and I spent one night feeling bad about it and then felt fine. I had a friend at the fort, a man named Augustin Beaumont Creole from Louisiana, a former Army surgeon who now did civilian practice at Bridger. Augie was 55 and had been married twice and widowed twice, and he was the most even-tempered man I have ever known. I told him what had happened, the whole of it, and he listened without interrupting, which is a rare quality in a man. When I finished, he said, "And?" I said, "And I'm staying." He said, "Then why are you telling me?" I said I didn't know, maybe to hear myself say it. He said, "You're staying because she's good." I said, "She's very good." He said, "And she sees you." I said, "She does." He said, "Caleb, you have been alone a long time and you have been making a virtue of it because making virtues of unavoidable things is how men survive them. This is not unavoidable." I said I understood that. He said, "Good. Now stop talking to me about it and go do something about it." I should tell you about the moment she came to find me. It was the end of the 2nd week. Late afternoon, sky turning that particular amber-orange it gets over the high plateau, the fort casting long shadows. I was at the water trough running a brush over my horse. His name was Josiah, which is a ridiculous name for a horse, but he'd come to me already named, and by the time I thought of changing it he'd gotten used to it, and Wickapi came and stood nearby. She watched me work for a while. I had learned by then that she was comfortable with silence, and so was I, and so neither of us felt the need to fill it. After a while she said, "I wrote to my aunt." I said, "The one near the Platte." She said, "A different one. She lives near a settlement south of here. Waziawakpa, the settlers call it Lodgepole Creek. She has been there 3 years with her husband's family. Good people." I said, "Did she write back?" She said, "I am waiting for it. I wanted you to know I wrote." I kept brushing Josiah's flank. I said, "Why?" She said, "Because if we are going to find a place and build something, I want there to be people. Not just you and me and Sakala. I want my family to know where I am." That was the first time she'd said it that plainly. If we are going to, not whether. If, meaning the condition, was already decided, and we were now talking about the details. I said, "That's a good thing to want." She said, "I know what I want." I looked at her over Josiah's back. She was standing in the amber light, straight-backed, her braid over one shoulder, Sakala somewhere behind her, probably doing something inadvisable with a fence post. She was looking back at me without anything to prove. I said, "I know you do." She came around the side of the horse and stood near me, close, not crowding, just close, and she reached up and touched my face with one hand, just the fingertips, just for a moment. It was the first time she'd touched me since the night of Sakala's fever. She said something in Lakota, quiet. I said, "I don't know those words." She said, "I know." I said them anyway. I put my hand over hers, there on my face, and held it for a moment. Josiah turned his head and gave us both a look of supreme indifference and went back to the trough. We found the place we were looking for in the spring of the following year. It took some doing. I spent the winter at Fort Bridger, more work, good money, and Wickopi's aunt wrote back and eventually came to visit, a strong woman named Chask's wife, which was her name by custom, though she also gave me an English name to use, Rosalie. She came with her 2 grandsons, and she and Wickopi talked for 2 straight days, and at the end of it Rosalie looked at me with the same assessment quality that I'd learned was something the women in this family did, and she said something in Lakota and Wickopi translated. She says, "You are good bone structure and you keep your promises, which is more important." I said I'd try to deserve both assessments. Rosalie laughed, Wickopi laughed, Sakala laughed without knowing what about, which is how children laugh. The land we found was in a river valley about 60 miles north of Bridger, south-facing slope, good water, protected from the worst of the north wind by a low ridge that curved around like a cupped hand. I'd found it on a scout the previous fall and kept it in mind. We put down a claim in March and started building in April. Hector Wines was there for the building. He'd wintered at Bridger with his family and decided against Oregon, same as me, and he was a useful man with lumber and stone. Augie Beaumont came for a week and put up a wall with surprising competence for a surgeon. 2 of Rosalie's grandsons came and stayed, young men who knew horses and cattle better than I did at their age, and who treated Wickopi with a respect that was also a kind of watching, making sure I was deserving of her. I understood that. I would have done the same. We built a house, not grand, good. Solid log construction, 2 rooms at first with plans for more. A real fireplace that Hector laid, and I will tell you it drew perfectly from the first fire we lit in it, which Hector took credit for, and I let him have. The first morning we woke up in that house, Wickopi and I, Sakala between us because she had migrated in the night. I lay looking at the ceiling in the early gray before full light. Smell of fresh pine. Cold. The particular stillness of a building that is newly inhabited. She was awake, I could tell by her breathing. She said without moving, "It's solid." I said, "It'll be solid for a long time." She said, "I meant you." I didn't say anything. She said, "I have been watching you build things for 9 months. The fire, the walls, the fence. You build solid. It is the same way you do everything." I said, "I try." She turned toward me. Sakala between us didn't stir. She put her hand flat on my chest and I put my hand over it. She said, "I am glad I did not go to the Black Hills." I said, "I'm glad of a great many things." She said, "Name one." I said, "The cinch ring on my saddle that stuck in July. That was 3 days before the ford crossing. I was fixing that ring when Hector told me what happened, so I was already there, already in the camp, already in the right place." She was quiet. I said, "The whole chain of it goes back to a stuck cinch ring." She said, "I don't believe in that kind of thing." I said, "Neither do I." She said, "But." I said, "But I'm glad the ring stuck." Outside the window the sky was going from gray to the pale yellow that comes before the sun crests the ridge. A horse made a sound in the corral, one of the geldings greeting the day. A magpie started up somewhere. Sakala made a small sound in her sleep and resettled and was quiet. Wickopi's hand was warm on my chest. We lay there listening to the land wake up. There was nothing I needed to say. There was nothing she needed to say. The sun came over the ridge, and the room filled with morning, and that was enough.